You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is Tuesday, April 11, 2023. I'm here with Federica Carugati. He's a lecturer in history and political economy at King's College London. Before joining the faculty at King's, Professor Carugati was at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and before that, she was the Associate Director of the Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University. Professor Carugati received her PhD in classics from Stanford University in a joint program also with political science, and her BA and MA in philosophy from the University of Bologna. She is the author of Crafting a Constitution, Law, Democracy, and Growth in Ancient Athens, which was published by Princeton in 2019. And she's a co-author with Margaret Levy of A Moral Political Economy, Present, Past, and Future, which was published by Cambridge in 2021. Thank you, Federica, for joining me today.
Thank you, Pete, for having me.
So let's start. How does a scholar of classics end up a scholar doing formal political theory in democracy and development?
Okay, let me clear out some of the premises that are correct, but perhaps there is a different way of putting it. I was a scholar of classics for a hot 5 minutes, but I think it is fair to say that I was never a scholar of classics in the way that most people are scholars of classics. I went to Stanford to study with Josh Ober and to study particularly the functioning of the Athenian democracy, and I was sort of obsessed coming from Italy in the late 1990s and early 2000s about the relation between political power and information. And I arrived at Stanford before the PhD. This was a sort of like a visiting stint that I did there. And Josh Ober put in my hands Democracy and Knowledge. And I was like, oops, someone thought about that. And so then I went back and I did my PhD, but I was sort of like working on questions of politics and political economy from the get-go. It seems perhaps absurd that one would learn ancient Greek in order to do that, but that's how it went down. So here I am. And very early on, this was like the time when Josh's collaboration with Barry Weingas was really blossoming. I got sort of like lucky enough to be there at the time when these two amazing scholars and thinkers and people were really hacking at what classical Athens and other pre-modern societies could be saying for political economists. And so I sort of like jumped on that bandwagon right from essentially my second semester when Josh and Barry taught a class. That was the first year that was called High Stakes Politics. And I never left. And I think that the way that I understand my contribution, if there is any at all, in this line of thinking is to sort of like broaden the scope of what is there when we think about political economy through the lens of pre-modern society? What can we say and what can we not say? So this, I think, is going to be, in part, what we're going to be talking about later on. The question of formal theory is really related to the question of method. This is, again, in part related to the project that Josh and Barry were sort of like exploring that always had game theory and sort of like a relatively easy formal methodology at hand as a tool that held a great explanatory power. But for me, what as a classical historian, in some respects, at least how I thought about myself in the early days of the PhD, the formal methods really enabled some theoretical advancement against the backdrop of a historical method based on empirical evidence. So what is the empirical evidence? We can only say what is in the books. But of course, when you think about the evidence formation in Athens, what's in the books is very little if you want to really understand the development of political institutions. So formal methodology allowed that sort of like a leap of faith, perhaps, to understand the process of institutional development in a way that the sources were simply not able to tell us.
There's kind of also a little bit of a consilience going on at the time, too, because there's a changing of our understanding of the empirical record of ancient Athens as well, right? So it's experiencing more economic growth than we thought and that kind of stuff. And so, leveraging that with the formal methods is actually kind of one of the parts that yeah.
Exactly. No, it was really the best time to be to be doing what Josh and Barry and Ian Morris and Walter Scheidel, the sort of like a so-called Stanford School of Ancient History, were beginning to do, or had just begun to do. And I think it is fair to say that whereas a part of the sort of like the approach was really to dig into the evidence and try to assess it. Through social scientific methodologies and see sort of like developments in terms of growth, development in terms of democracy, and so on and so forth. What I was exposed to in terms of like the Josh and Barry particularly was sort of like, let's jump on the bandwagon of economic growth. Like we have significant evidence, and of course, particularly Josh will start continuing to like look at the empirical evidence coming out of ancient Greece. But it was really a change of paradigm. Like we are asking different questions, not just because, exactly as you're saying, not just because we have new methods, but also because we are being showered with evidence that seems to suggest a very different story than what we had known before. And so it was really the best time to be studying ancient history through a social science approach.
I promise I won't try to push you to focus on methodology for too long, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about your methodology because you're very self-consciously challenging a lot of people's ideas about what we can learn from pre-modern societies, and taking also countering various objections concerning the size, the homogeneity and exclusionary practices. And I was just wondering if you could maybe articulate that a little bit for the audience, because they can learn from this issue having to do with the case involved, but also questions of case selection and others, because besides, ancient Athens, we also can learn from, say, for example, the whole debate about Italy, for example, and the history of Italy and southern and northern Italy and those kind of things, the two kingdoms of Sicily and, these kind of things. And so there's just a lot in there to unpack for political economists. And I was hoping you could address the issue of the size, the homogeneity, and the exclusion.
Yeah, so I think there is two parts to this question. One is about like what we can do with these cases from pre-modern society and how much we can sort of stretch the comparative paradigm. And the second is, well, once we have established that those cases are actually perhaps worth looking into, what can we do with them for a broad understanding of political and economic dynamics? So let me sort of like take the first step. I think that Athens is, so now I'm engaged in a much broader sort of like a data collection about collective governance institutions essentially across history, where I am feeling very sad to have abandoned the case of Athens because it is in fact extremely well documented compared to essentially anything else that we see emerging from the historical record, at least in terms of collective governance institutions. And so once we have cases like this, or in general, when we're asking questions about political institutions in the pre-modern world, how much can we stretch this comparative paradigm? How much can we really say that these cases speak to problems that we see today? And so in trying to, particularly for my first book, in trying to articulate the main challenges from a political economy, from the political economic theory at least, size, homogeneity, and exclusion really came up as the most obvious. And perhaps not the only ones, but certainly the most obvious. And so the story about Athens and the story about other cases of pre-modern development is that, well, the city is so small, cooperation, collaboration are easier. And I think that's fair to say that is true. But I also don't think that we should stretch that too far. Athens is a massive place if you walk and have zero ways of communicating with your partners that are not, I don't know, like technologically, like from the perspective of infrastructure and communication technology, this is a place that has extraordinarily significant limits, and that makes collaboration and cooperation difficult, right? So the idea that from the Laurian minds, Athens it takes what, like a bike ride or something. That was not the case in ancient Athens. And so we need to consider the question of size within the technological and geographical challenges that the Athenians themselves faced in the 5th and the 4th century BC. Once we do that, we're still left with the fact that Athens is smaller than most modern cases. But I think the way that I think about it is that I try to flip that as a benefit, as an advantage instead of a challenge. It is smaller, it is simpler, and therefore we can actually understand processes of institutional dynamics better, more clearly than we can in vast, complex societies. And whether that is possible or not is, I think, still open to debate. I don't think that my book or the work of Josh Ober before me and others has established whether that is in fact, the truth or not. But this is the claim that size, certainly Athens is smaller than most modern nations, but that the challenges to cooperation are similar, right, in terms of communication technology in particular. The second is to do with homogeneity, which again, it's a question of whether we think about Athens through the lens of modern, what matters today, or if we think about Athens as through the lens of what mattered then. And of course, there is to some extent, we cannot know what mattered then, but certainly questions of heterogeneity based on ethnicity or religion that tend to be the sort of like the traits that modern political economy looks at. We don't see that in Athens. But should we then conclude then Athens was a homogeneous society in which, again, cooperation was simple because everyone shared the same language? And I think it is, again, fair to say, sure, there were challenges to cooperation that we face in modern large-scale societies that the Athenians did not face. But we still have plentiful evidence of discord, of civil war, of war, and we should try to understand what traits made cooperation difficult in Athens. And so if it's a matter of sort of shifting the categories in some respects. And so in Athens in particular, like socioeconomic condition and ideas about oligarchy or democracy, sort of ideas about like ideal types of governance, certainly created rifts among people. And so in that respect, the Athenians were not as homogeneous as I think most people think of them. Finally, there's the question of exclusion. And this has been, I think, one of the most interesting things that came out of the dissertation originally and then the book is to think about the question of sort of like exclusion and inclusion. Because, of course, if we think about Athens, we look at a political system that had an extraordinary level of inclusion if we consider its historical counterparts. So Persia, for example, that's usually the comparison. And it's like, no, the Athenians were pretty inclusive if the alternative is Darius. But of course, the Athenians were not as inclusive as we would like them to be, compared to, again, standards that we apply from Western liberal democracies. And so once again, the process is one of sort of like a unpacking what exclusion and inclusion meant in Athens. And so when part of the book project and the one sort of like a long-standing article that came out of it was to try to think about the process of extending inclusion that went on in ancient Athens in the period that in post-constitution that I was looking at. And we see this really remarkable process of expanding inclusion in these selected spheres. And I think that there's a lot there to be said about the ways in which political economy think about inclusions for very good reasons, about political inclusion, but uniquely about political inclusion, which is, of course, a very high stakes demand. I think that what pre-modern societies can do by sort of like removing almost by definition the idea that there would be any sort of like a normative or positive reason to have anything remotely close to universal inclusion. We see in Athens in the course of the 4th century this sort of like a gradual process of expansion of inclusion that I think can tell us a lot about what, on the one hand, how the process of extending inclusion might work, but also how it can work in the context of a post-conflict sort of like a situation, particularly when it comes to sort of like a very different demands. So how do you integrate demands in a post-conflict setting? This was what I think in some respects, again, I went to Stanford thinking about Italy, and I wrote the book thinking about this other case that was very much involved at the time, the case of Myanmar. And I was really trying to think about the process of inclusion and constitution making in Athens in terms of like what it really told us.
No, this is great. I actually, one of the things I that's a follow up on this is that it's related to the argument about stability and development, because it's about the focus on process as opposed to just initial conditions. So one of the things that I think that both Barry and Deirdre have identified, Deirdre more colorful criticisms, Barry more subtle like criticisms in some sense of the standard neo-institutionalism, Acemoglu and Robinson, but also North Wallace and Weingast, is that a lot of the story that they tell is all baked into the initial conditions. And so they explain the location of a society, not the transitions of the society. And you argue in a paper with Barry that's in Public Choice that, your focus is on these transitions. Like, how is it that you go from, the natural state to get onto the doorstep conditions to then from the doorstep conditions? And your story that you tell about pre-modern ancient Athens actually is laying that story out. And so I wanted you to sort of articulate a little bit on that focus on processes of transition that you've developed. I mean, you go over this again in your annual review piece as well. And how do you build that kind of institutional infrastructure? That doesn't just happen overnight. And it takes little small steps here and there. And I think it's very wise, the point that you just made about trying to view these societies within the context within which they existed too. So again, in our standard game theoretic perspective, the idea of cooperation being non-problematic is when we have small groups of agents that are homogeneous. That's because we can rely purely on reputation mechanisms. But in a world where transportation from one side of the city to the other side of the city is actually quite fast, and that there's actually more than, there's thousands of people rather than just a small group of 200 people or whatever, we can't rely on reputation mechanisms. We have to find these other institutional substitutions, right? And so, being able to identify those things is crucial to understanding development. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that this was actually ended up in a paper with Barry and Gillian Hadfield, and I think that was really the point where I started thinking about Athens as this really remarkable case, because in some respects, from the perspective of an ancient historian, which probably none of your audience or no one's interested in this right now, but like I think that my book and my work is always subject to the proviso that I'm looking at some of the evidence but not others, and if you really look at all the evidence, you look at you can tell a story about Athens that is built on reputation. It's the reputation of the orators that give speeches in the assembly, and they're there for a bunch of years, and it's like. And that is fair enough, right? And so in trying to highlight some of the dynamics, the institutional processes that I do with the methodology that I use, I'm not trying to tell a story in which reputation did not matter. I'm just trying to tell a story in which it couldn't have mattered for some, for the stability of the social order to the extent that for as long as it lasted. And I think that in some respects, thinking about speeches in the assembly, you always get roped into the Demosthenes or the Pericles of the era. But when you think about enforcement, things become really interesting. And so the paper with Gillian and Barry was a paper that was trying to explain how coordination in the absence of a police force, coordination in the absence of centralized enforcement works, because at that point, it is not just what Demosthenes tells you with his reputation. It's about the principles, norms, and institutions that regulated lay citizens. And so, again, the Demosthenes and the Pericles mattered a great deal in Athens, like our politicians matter today as well. But you cannot explain the level of development, I think it is fair to say, of a polis, of a place like ancient Athens, just by relying on reputational mechanisms. So that was, that was really, I think that when we were thinking about the enforcement part, it really clicked for me that this was a particularly important case. When it comes to the question of transitions that you were asking before, I think that for me that was if I ever had any sort of like a question mark when I was talking to Barry, it was always at the point where transitional processes were framed in the logical formal political theory as transitions between equilibria. And I was looking at this evidence of these speeches and these inscriptions and these coins, and these were telling this extraordinarily complex story that then I tried, and this was like why it took me 5 years to publish that book from the dissertation. I was trying to sell to political economists the story of the black box of the shock. Right? How do you get from one equilibrium to another? Well, it's a lot of fighting, and it's a lot of sort of like processes that are, and here's the additional challenge, processes that are really hard to grasp. This is change that is normative in the real sense of the word. And so it was very difficult for me to figure out how to sell the language of process to political economists. And I struggled with that a lot. So the question, the book on the constitutional transition is the story of this consensus building that occupied a good chunk of my sort of like a PhD years. I know that this is going on, but how do I formalize it? How do I speak? How do I communicate it in a language that political economists can understand? And I'm not really sure that I actually succeeded there. But I think that in part speaks to my inability to do so, but it also speaks to the challenge of today of thinking about what happens in those moments of transition. And I don't think that we have, as economists or political economists, we have sort of like agreed on a language that is not the language of equilibrium.
Yeah, it's a big puzzle that we all face, from fundamental theory to any kind of application. For a lot of institutional economists, the sort of Stephen Chung discussion of the equilibrium contract between the bee, farmers and the orchard growers, we always say, oh, look at how they came up with an optimal contract or whatever. And I always try to tell my students, but at one point, there must not have been a contract, and they must have recognized that there was a conflict. And so the explanation has to give priority to the cleverness and creativity of the individuals that occupy our models, that come up with these various different solutions along the way in what you could be as evolution towards a solution, rather than the idea of just a solution concept. And I think Barry actually is I don't know if it's because of you or whatever, but if you read his critique of what he calls the neoclassical fallacy, right? The neoclassical institutional fallacy, I think that's what he's getting at, is that they've lost track of the ability to explain the process of institution formation in some sense. And whether or not we have the right language for it is still tough.
Yeah, and I think, in some respects, the book project was born as a paper in which I was applying the self-enforcing constitution paper that he wrote with Sonia Mittal about the U.S. To Athens. And so what I was trying to get at was essentially what they called, harking back to Doug North, adaptive efficiency. But then again, it's what I call consensus. They call adaptive efficiency. We're making strides, or maybe baby steps, towards some sort of like a language that can give us a way to talk about what happens during that shock. But I don't, maybe I just simply, this is the product of my ignorance, but I don't know that we have a strong theoretical way of thinking about these moments. And I think that that's where things matter. Like, everyone is able to explain ex post, why, given sufficient evidence, why the solution is self-enforcing with the benefit of hindsight, but how people get there. And I think that was, for me, what was really motivating my comparison with Myanmar, is that we don't want to do that, right? And this was the same stuff that I was seeing, of course, pardon me the absurd comparison in some respects, but it is not obvious that people with fundamentally different ideas of what the world looks like would agree on rules and values that are to govern their lives moving forward. I think very often we see the continuation of conflict, and Athens stood out to me as a case in which that did not happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's the potential for conflict at all times is, breaks down, right? All things. So it's really the process of development at some level is the process of turning, I don't know how you'll react to this, but turning all these sharp objects that could be impediments to lead to conflict and violence, but dulling them enough so that rather than eliminating them, we actually don't get mortally wounded by them, but we continue to get through. But it's still, we're getting scraped and bruised. And, I know that you worked at the Ostrom workshop, and I've done a lot of work on Eleanor and Vincent over the years, and I knew them both. And one of the things that was always amazing with Lynn was her laugh. She had this amazing, infectious laugh. But if you listen to any of the interviews with her, one of the things that she says is, what's one of the first things that we learned? And she laughs and she says, people argue. They're in conflict all the time, and they figure out ways in which they could cooperate in the face of all of that. That's what she's really trying to get at. And they're negotiating their space. And I think that she had a language to try to talk about process, but it's not one that's universally accepted, right? But it's one that was one way in which she tried to do that. And, we're all just trying to figure this out. But, our language is much easier to understand when we have solution concepts, right? That those are easier. And, one way to think about what she was talking about, and I think it related to your project in general, is, there is a point in which the game requires that we actually generate the common knowledge by which we play the game. And if we don't have that common knowledge, then we can't play the game in the first place. We break down into conflict. So how is it that we form? What are the processes by which we actually come to form the common knowledge by which we can then play the game from?
Yeah, no, and honestly, the more I work and the more I feel that my entire career and way of thinking is subsumed by what Lynn Ostrom did in her career. So sometimes that feels a little frustrating, but also mostly exciting and engaging in the sense that you're right. It is a tradition of institutional analysis that, in fact, tried to develop a parallel language, and I think that it did an enormous it's an enormous gift of scholarship. That language. I also don't think that it has translated as widely, I guess, enough to become a lingua franca of institutional analysis. I think it's despite the fact that the Ostromian community is large and alive and kicking, and so I think that's you remind me of a very important attempt. Beside of the institutional tradition associated with Doug North and Barry and others. I mean, I guess that the other thing that these comments suggested, and I think that this is the other Ostromian project or Ostromian influence in what I try to do, is the idea that it is very difficult to talk about development if you presume to know where that process ends. And I think that when I was studying Athens, and I was honestly I was a PhD in classics that was spending her summers in Sierra Leone working with paralegal organizations to try to figure out how these guys were governing and resolving disputes in a world in which the state was incapable of reaching. Where there's 30 lawyers in Freetown, and that's it. So good luck building courts. And I was trying to figure out, that was what was really animating my work. And in some respects, I was really puzzled to hear that what the law and development community was doing was to try to think about how to build courts and train lawyers, which of course is of enormous value. But here I was in this thriving legal normative space where people were doing law. They were just not doing it in the way that Western legal philosophers and practitioners and lawyers did it. And in some respects, some of the tools that they were using were really reminding me of my work on other societies. But that for me was a real, again, a wake-up call. There is no obvious answer here as to what kind of institution is needed in order to get to the goal where people don't kill each other or steal from each other or do all the things that we associate with constitutional and legal governance. And I think that this is really the other part of your earlier question, which is what, once we have established that pre-modern societies, and particularly well-documented societies like Athens, are a comparative case, what do we do with them? And I think that the greatest gift in some respects of these places is that they really discipline our thinking about what lies inside when the fighting ends, because it is not obvious that anyone needs to go to Denmark or Sweden, and certainly not the United States. Well, with all the respect that I have for a country that I now miss very much.
I was going to try, your work is so filled with fascinating ideas. And one of the ones that I just came across was this paper in the winter issue of Daedalus, which is on these governance archaeology, which is your database that you were just talking about. But this just fascinated me in the discussion that you just had about self-governance or governance in environments different than our own, which is what you were just talking about, because that's all part of building this imagery of various different possible worlds that we could imagine. So talk a little bit about this project.
We talked earlier about transitions, and this is really where places like Athens can tell you a lot because the evidence is really remarkable. And so you combine economic growth, democracy, constitutionalism, and a decent amount of evidence, and you're like, okay, I can spend a few years of my life studying this. When you get out of Athens, Rome, and other Western, essentially, cases, the evidence becomes really, really difficult. And so it becomes certainly difficult to do the kind of sort of like a diachronic study on transitions. And so what I'm trying to do now is to look at places particularly focusing beyond Western Europe, or sort of like a canonical associated societies, and to think more broadly about what collective governance has looked like through the ages in places that range from sub-Saharan Africa to sort of indigenous North America to Oceania and Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. And so it is the database is trying to take a very serious look at these institutions for collective governance. On the one hand, this is the empirical part, right? So we're looking at collective governance institutions across space and time, premodern, and we're trying to figure out what did collective governance look like in places that we don't know very much about. And again, like the sort of a takeaway from that project is to really learn a little bit more about collective governance institutions per se. And what we are learning is that collective governance, and this is again on the heels of work of people like David Savage and other people that have started to seriously take seriously the experience of past societies beside the Western canon. What we're learning is that there's collective governance essentially as soon as you start looking. But in many cases, it did not look like ancient Athens, but it was nested within this much more hierarchical structures. And this is extremely interesting to me because what this work is all about is not to sort of like at the end of the day, go to a political economist, let alone a politician, and say, oh, you know what? I've got the empirical evidence that suggests that we can govern ourselves collectively, like top to bottom. And of course, that's I don't think that's feasible. And so the question is how you nest participatory, inclusive collective governance within more hierarchical structures. And I think that this database project might help us, begin to sort of like a hack at that question. The second problem, however, is the problem of the evidence that becomes, as I was mentioning earlier, and this is what we were focusing on in the Daedalus piece, as soon as we get out of the West, it becomes extraordinarily limited, and it is often filtered through the lens of colonial domination. And in some respects, this is, any anthropologist, sociologist, and ethnographer knows this. But if you look at, for example, some of the information for sub-Saharan African societies, for many years from the work of, people like Fortes and Evans Pritchard, so I'm not talking about, unknown figures here. These people were suggesting things like, there is no governance institutions in these societies. Again, this will sound tremendously hubristic, but it is impossible. In some respects, it is impossible that a society of any sort of like a significant scale did not have means to govern itself in terms of decision making, in terms of enforcement, in terms of the decisions that allow people to access or not institutions, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to sort of like wade through the evidence, and we are trying to do this with what we call this ethic of ancestry, which is a sort of like a serious look at where the evidence comes from. In an attempt in time to really liaise and engage with scholars from around the world, the scholars that speak more languages than we do, scholars that are familiar with things like oral histories and traditions of scholarship that are not as hip in the West, and to really start to sort of like, again, this is supposed to be like we call it a global commons of collective governance practices. So the echoes of Lynn are again very, very present and very clear. But we're trying to do this with a sense that the evidence that we are looking at is wildly imprecise, and that we need to pay attention to that.
Well, you're dealing, as Christina Buccieri says it, norms in the wild, right? So one of the things that I'm not sure that a couple of your colleagues at King's College would be familiar with stuff that we've been doing over the years, but we have a lot of corresponding interest. So this issue of what we call endogenous rule formation, which is how is it that you, rather than treating the institutions as exogenous and then studying the pattern of behavior in it, how is it that those institutions evolve and over time? And so when I was actually thinking about doing my dissertation, if your Daedalus article had come out when I was a graduate student, I would have been like a puppy dog at your door asking to be part of your project, because I read this book, Sally Falk Moore's Laws of Process. It's about basically an anthropological examination of these things. I was really fascinated by this endogenous rule formation. And, we have tried to do that with respect to transition development and failed and weak states, and also natural disasters. Any kind of way where you can test bed the ideas, where you put pressure on them so that the existing institutions are the reason why the system is in chaos that needs to somehow evolve. So anyway, I'm totally, I'm completely a fanboy and fascinated by what you're doing because of this. I don't know if you're familiar with it, or maybe I missed but there's also this really cool project that's going on in Europe right now called on constitutional compliance. Do you know this literature at all? Stefan Voigt, who's in Hamburg, is doing this major data set on constitutional compliance, which tries to, one way is that sometimes constitutions are just incentive incompatible, but another time, they may in fact be, the norms may disagree, like all kinds of different things. So it relates again to your questions that you're talking about in that paper with, as you mentioned, with Barry and Gillian Hatfield, that's in the Journal of Legal Analysis, right? So anyway, I just think there's a lot of people that are very fascinated by this at the moment. So hopefully we can find a language.
So I think so. And so let me just add a little pebble to this, because I think that this is an extraordinarily important development that is relatively recent, and I think still more niche than it should be. But let me give a shout out to the work that Gillian is doing today, as in these days, which I think is really, I don't know if it's contributing to a language, but it is certainly contributing some ways of thinking that are new and interesting and different. And so she has been thinking about evolution of norms in context for many, many years. And part of the attempt at sort of looking at Athens was, again, the attempt to use a sort of a large scale, so to speak, society, as opposed to looking at, small, bands or small groups, which is where the sort of law and economics literature was leaving us, right? You think about the early, the cattle ranchers and the diamond dealers. We know about the evolution of norms. We know how they get to be self-enforcing, but again, we have these problems of size and homogeneity and other versions of that that make it difficult to sort of essentially generalize. And the case of Athens that we were looking at was the case of a, larger scale society, certainly a society that was sort of, again, relatively developed and was around for a while. And so the question of how to do that at that scale was somewhat different than thinking about the cattle ranchers or the diamond dealers or the gold miners. And so that's where sort of we left it there in 2015 with Gillian, who has now sort of enlisted the entire world of computer science and agent-based modeling to try to really think about this question in a new way. And I think that this is an extraordinarily important development. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily going to, it will eventually contribute to theory building into a language. But what this is allowing us is to play with models that are extremely extremely more complex than what we were able to do even 10 years ago. And in that complexity, we can begin to really play with questions of norms, of values, of the complexity of human behavior, of the complexity of motivation, and so on and so forth. And I think that this is, in fact, to the extent that it is possible for people like me or Jillian, scholars in the social sciences, to seriously engage, people that speak a very different language. I think that there are enormously productive, potentially, outcomes there.
It's a big aspect of all this. There's a great book, by the way, that just came out last year, but Harvard, called We the Miners by Andrea McDowell. And it's about self-governance in the California gold rush. And it's the same thing like what you're talking about with the cattle ranchers, like the old Ellickson piece or whatever. And it's just that there's a lot of really, it's a big, thick book too. So it's filled with details. And so there's so much fascinating history. But I wanted to give you some time to talk about this other project, which is related to the moral political economy, project that you did with the Cambridge Elements monograph with Margaret Levy. And, now I might be reading too much into it. And so you can tell me I'm wrong or whatever. But I do think that it's a short book that has a very powerful message, but the messages go in slightly different directions depending on who you're listening to talk about it. So, Margaret, for example, is very concerned with a general critique of economics at some sense at the moment, and like the neoliberal critique and being part of that conversation. Whereas when I read you, I see more that you're focused on creating space in the social sciences for a broader notion of theory and a richer notion of empirical research or whatever. But if I hand out the moral political economy to my graduate students, which I do, what is it that you want to get across to them for developing their research program for the next decade or so?
So let me just say one thing before I get going, because this is like a wild understatement of Margaret's contribution, which I feel the need to rectify. Margaret has been an intellectual leader and a sort of like as she is in life, sort of like a force of nature behind this project. The book and the actual sort of program that we ran at the Center for Advanced Studies, and in many respects, when she started thinking about this in 2017, 2018, we were still thinking in terms of what the critiques are. But very early on, she essentially began to organize the group that then became sort of a group associated with the Moral Political Economy Project at CASBIS, around the essentially motto, okay, we know what's wrong, but now what do we do? Right. So in some respects, the book is really trying to sort of begin that conversation, because it is very difficult to say, what do we do? Right. How do we reconstruct a political economic framework? Yes, we know that they are not, stable. It's not stable, but they're not sort of fixed. But that is, doesn't get us very far in terms of thinking what is next. And in some respects, it turns out that, again, pre-modern societies and collective governance in the wild, perhaps, can begin to sort of move in the direction of what's next. But again, it's not in a vacuum, right? I think that it is fair to say that what the ruin of neoliberalism or the fragility of neoliberalism has demonstrated is the sort of a thirst for participatory spaces, whether they're online or offline. We see experiments around the world with participatory governance. It started out a long time ago. I'm well aware of that, but I think it is fair to say that there are now experiments like large-scale citizen assemblies, the creation of a permanent citizen assembly in Belgium. That is honestly a striking development in terms of thinking about participation and participatory structures in the modern world. There is a lot of sort of a thirst for these kinds of spaces, and this is sort of where the evidence from the pre-modern world comes in handy, because we don't have a lot of evidence of how to do participation in the West, because we have thought for a long time that the sort of like a, representative institutions that were created through the, various important historical moments, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on and so forth, are the telos of development, are the end of development. And once that sort of like a story begins to show some fragility, it is not obvious where to go to find out what's new. And so you can speculate in the sense of scenarios. You can just like begin to work with your friends and neighbors. But I think that at the level of political institutions, at the level of like a systemic thinking about participation in the modern world, the evidence from pre-modern societies is really essential to any sort of like empirically based claim. It's not uniquely essential, but it is certainly an important story. And so, but again, if you ask me then what my vision for the development of this research program is, it is certainly not let's all become ancient historian and begin to dig in Thailand and try to figure out like how they did participatory governance there so that we can figure out how to do it here. I think that here is in terms of like the development of the project of moral political economies is a very serious, collective, interdisciplinary sort of like an attempt at reforming the way we teach political economy. And this is like, I'm going to take a tangent to historical political economy in a moment, but also the way we teach it, not just like what are the theories, but also what we tell our students that is possible. And so I teach all my classes trying to get students that have no interest whatsoever, in most cases, to think creatively about institution buildings, to engage in that exercise. And I think that the more political economy can do that. Of course, at the end of the day, we all want to figure out what institutions will, enable a fairer, more sustainable, society. But I don't know that it is my job. And certainly it is, I don't think it is anyone's sort of like a solitary job to design the institutions for the future. And so, again, this is about how we teach and how we think about what is possible. That is, in some respects, like where I see productive developments of this project moving forward.
So we were together in Chicago to read the last, I guess, draft before it was published of the narrow corridor. But a year ago, I was also at a similar conference for Bill Easterly's most recent book that isn't out yet. That was in May of 2022 up at NYU. And the book is called Saviors versus Skeptics. And what's fascinating about it, related to what you were just talking about, is he goes through the history of development economics and those people who line themselves up as saviors of the societies that they're trying to bring development to versus those who are skeptics and think that development has to be a project of the consent of the individuals that are engaged in the process of development itself. And I think it's a really, really interesting book about that aspect of development by consent, which relates to your point about participation, as opposed to development by technocratic experts who have to rule over you. It's an old Ostrom line, right? Again, which is the difference between governing with versus governing over. And so much of our social science was done for so long about governing over because we thought we were the trained experts. And part of the fragility that we learned was that not only was that incorrect, it was damaging to the societies that we were talking to in terms of all the stuff that came out of it. So I'm on board with that aspect of the moral political economy project and the teaching. I think the question, do you have exercises that you give the students to try to get them to think about institution building?
I wish. No, I don't. Because, first of all, I don't have PhD students in my current job, which is very sad. And my master's students are busy, and I don't want to bother them with, in a 1 year, very high stakes program, bother with the question of serious engagement with creation. But I think that they get excited. If I am not a complete fool about my teaching, I think that people get excited. They get out of their seat. It's sort of like, at least sort of like for a moment. When you flip the question, I teach a class that's called Institutions and Economic Development, and I don't expect them to learn about, theories and replicate them and, give them like tests and stuff. But I ask them to then apply what they've learned to problems that they see in the world. And I think it is fair to say that, the problems are not as creative as I guess but I'm also, wondering how we ask students to think creatively, but not, pie in the sky. Like let's build a ministry. So I don't know that I think that I'm struggling with getting them on board with the idea. And I haven't quite gotten to the point yet where I am serious about it, to the point that I am designing exercises to help them think, in part because I don't know how to do it myself, right? This is what I do with the ancient world. And I can't get too much ancient world on my students' plate because they need jobs. And I got lucky enough, but it's not many of us that get jobs doing this kind of work. So I'm very respectful and conscious of the limits of this exercise.
Yeah, no, I get that. Anyway, that's a very promising project that's coming out of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences and the different projects that you're doing there. So I think that's.
Let me just another shout out to a friend and a colleague. There is a group at Johns Hopkins that is now building, led by Angus Bergen, who was like another amazing participant in the More Political Economy project at CASBUS, that is actually trying to think much more systematically about the project of how to teach more political economy to students with a full major. So I think, these are ideas that I have had the honor and privilege to participate in, and that I try to develop in my practice. But there are other people that are like putting serious time into thinking about how to teach more political economy to students. And again, in some respects, this is also what you do with the PPE program. This is not a new thing, but I think that there's a new demand. And there's a new sort of like a wave of thinking about how to teach more political economy to students by crossing disciplinary boundaries, by asking tough questions, by challenging students to think creatively about institutions. And this is like a real, if there's anything in the world to be optimistic about these days, that's one thing.
We just started a new program. I'm not the main driver of it. My colleague Virgil Storr and Stephanie Halfley are the main drivers, but it's an annual conference called Markets and Society. And, Viviane Zelizer, the economic sociologist, was one of the keynotes last year, along with Deirdre and others. But, the event that's coming up next fall is already jam-packed, and they've really done an amazing job with it, and hopefully we can get you to come over someday and do that. I think that'd be great. I'm gonna pivot now and ask you a rather out of the ballpark question, which I cleared with you in doing the background sort of looking at your stuff besides your papers. I learned that you were a professional basketball player, and I love the game of basketball. I love it much more than I was ever able to play it. So my love of the game far exceeded my skills in playing the game. But I still am crazy. But what experiences did that life as a professional athlete teach you that you draw on for your scholarly career?
So I'm going to be really boring starting out on this question, because I think that there is some like absolute truth that sports do for you. That is the disciplining factor. Like I'm if you put me with a task in front of me, like I'll finish it. Like I might, not see the end. It is a disciplining school. And I played, okay, let me just start by like wildly, so qualifying the term professional basketball player. I was a professional basketball player in the sense that I played basketball and I received money in return. It was very little, very, very little. And but it lasted for a very long time. And so I started playing when I was 8, and by the time I started playing with the senior team, which is how sports work in Italy. So we are not associated with school. Sort of like the sports associations are completely separate. And so I started playing with essentially what would be this most senior team when I was very, very young, when I was 12. And at that point, I started they started like throwing a few bucks at me. And then when I went to the United States, I learned that was professional sports. And so I say that I'm a professional athlete, but I don't know that a lot of my friends would consider me a professional, probably like a semi-professional-ish, something like that. But it was a huge part of my life. And honestly, like if you had asked my mother at the age of 14 if I was going to become a university professor, she would have laughed in your face. So that was but again, like you start playing very young in high stakes games. I was going all over. It was national championships. I had a stint with the national team. So it was a serious thing, and it was a serious thing for me. And everything around life was in service of basketball. For many, many years. And so that devotion to the cause, perhaps, that sort of like a passion about your practice, that is, I think, something that has translated oddly to the work that I am now doing but when I'm remunerated a little bit more, I guess that's one way of saying it. And then I don't know, but it is so in some sense it is discipline, and in some sense it is the passion. And so it's like what sort of like gets you up in the morning is like the idea that you want to get a little bit better at either playing or figuring out like what collective governance institutions looked like in sub-Saharan Africa circa 1500. I think that those are the two things that sports has done for me. And I've struggled. I stopped playing when I moved to California, when I started my PhD. So I was 26, career marred by like several injuries, so relatively short and uninteresting for most people. But I've really struggled to find that passion again in sports. And maybe this is why I've transferred it almost entirely to work. Maybe that's. If you find an alternative sport, maybe you don't become as passionate about work as I am. I don't know.
Well, we don't want that to happen, so don't. But still go out there and maybe you'll get involved in coaching at some point.
I rock climb these days, so it's a completely different, very, very different experience.
You'll have to be quite disciplined, though. But that is a very important lesson, I think, what you just said, discipline and passion. I think those are great characteristics that lead to good things when we, focus on that. And especially, when you recognize that like basketball, for example, is a team game played by individuals. And so, it's always creativity within the structure of the team.
Maybe that's why I co-author so much.
Well, anyway, it's been fantastic talking to you. I wish you all the best with your work. I do think that this project that you have laid out in this Daedalus thing has a potential to be very, very important for all of our students here. And I hope that they will contribute to that literature on this governance archaeology thing. So it's really quite amazing.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you so much, Pete. It was really a pleasure to see you again and to chat for a bit.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.